A regulatory reporting system defines fixed disclosure windows tied to safe harbor protection. Compliance within these windows limits exposure to escalating scrutiny, so procedural timing becomes the primary constraint shaping behavior. Once the reporting window becomes predictable, disclosure is no longer evaluated continuously. It is evaluated relative to when information enters the system, shifting the incentive toward timing rather than completeness. Market actors recognize that risk disclosed inside the protected window carries reduced regulatory consequence. They begin to align disclosure events with the reporting cycle, producing early signs of timing-based adaptation. What appears as improved compliance is actually synchronized disclosure behavior. The system registers more on-time reports, while the underlying risk distribution remains unchanged. A common interpretation is that stricter reporting frameworks increase transparency. However, the increase in procedural compliance does not imply earlier or more accurate risk recognition. The breakdown emerges when risk accumulates before the reporting window opens. Actors defer disclosure until the protected interval, concentrating information release rather than distributing it over time. This creates a review bottleneck where multiple disclosures arrive simultaneously. Regulatory capacity becomes constrained, and the depth of review per disclosure decreases under volume pressure. The system still processes disclosures as compliant because they meet formal timing rules. Yet the review process is structurally bypassed as throughput replaces scrutiny. Instead of reducing risk, the reporting structure redistributes it into the pre-disclosure period. Risk remains unobserved until it is procedurally safe to reveal, tightening the coupling between timing and visibility. Another assumption is that delayed disclosure reflects negligence or avoidance, but the behavior aligns directly with the incentive to minimize exposure within allowed procedural boundaries. Actors are not optimizing for truth visibility. They are optimizing for the safest point of disclosure under regulatory rules. As more participants adopt this timing strategy, disclosure clustering intensifies. The reporting cycle itself becomes the organizing force of market transparency. This clustering further weakens the regulator's ability to differentiate signal from volume. The system shifts from continuous monitoring to episodic processing under load. The initial intent of stability protection remains formally intact. Reports are filed correctly, and compliance metrics improve at the surface level. However, the underlying system begins to retain risk between reporting cycles. Risk is not eliminated. It is temporarily repositioned into less visible intervals. Over time, actors internalize that procedural safety outweighs early disclosure. The dominant strategy becomes waiting for the safe harbor window, rather than exposing risk immediately. This produces a stable pattern where disclosure timing converges across the market. Behavior is no longer varied by risk profile, but by reporting schedule alignment. The regulatory system adapts by focusing on procedural adherence rather than temporal accuracy. Compliance becomes decoupled from real-time risk visibility. What looks like a well-functioning reporting system is actually a synchronized delay mechanism. The system stabilizes around procedure-safe risk retention rather than continuous transparency. At equilibrium, both regulator and market operate within the same constrained timing structure. Risk persists inside the system, revealed only when it is least penalized to do so. As reporting cycles repeat, actors begin to plan risk exposure backward from the disclosure window. Risk-taking decisions are no longer evaluated against real-time conditions, but against whether they can be contained until the next protected interval, tightening the link between action and reporting timing. This introduces a time horizon mismatch where short-term risk accumulation becomes rational as long as it fits inside the reporting gap. The system begins to tolerate higher interim risk levels because those risks remain procedurally invisible until disclosure, increasing latent system load. Regulatory review remains anchored to the moment of disclosure, not to the period when risk was generated. This temporal compression reduces the ability to reconstruct causality, weakening the connection between observed data and underlying behavior. As a result, disclosures start to carry less informational value despite being formally complete. The system processes information that is temporarily misaligned with the decisions that produced it, degrading interpretability. Actors recognize that once risk is disclosed within the safe harbor, retrospective scrutiny is limited. They begin structuring activities so that exposure peaks just before the reporting window, then resets immediately after, creating cyclical risk concentration. This cyclical pattern amplifies across participants who are all responding to the same reporting schedule. Instead of independent risk distributions, the market develops synchronized exposure peaks, increasing systemic correlation. What appears as stable periodic reporting now masks synchronized vulnerability intervals. The system becomes more fragile during pre-disclosure phases, even as post-disclosure metrics suggest stability. The review bottleneck intensifies as synchronized disclosures continue to arrive in clusters. Regulatory throughput adapts by prioritizing procedural completion over depth, reinforcing the bypass of detailed evaluation. This creates a feedback loop where high-volume reporting justifies lighter review, and lighter review encourages further clustering. The system stabilizes around throughput efficiency rather than informational accuracy. An alternative reading would suggest that increasing reporting frequency could resolve this compression. But since the incentive is tied to protected timing rather than frequency itself, behavior would reorganize around the new boundary, not eliminate the clustering. Actors remain responsive to where the protection boundary is placed, not to how often it appears. The constraint shifts, but the timing arbitrage persists, preserving the same structural behavior. Over time, internal coordination aligns with reporting cycles rather than operational realities. Decisions are sequenced to fit disclosure timing, embedding the reporting window into the core planning process. This alignment further locks behavior into the cycle, as deviating from the schedule increases exposure without increasing benefit. The cost of early disclosure remains higher than the cost of delayed alignment, reinforcing convergence. As convergence deepens, variability in disclosure timing disappears across the market. Uniform timing reduces informational diversity, making it harder to distinguish between genuinely low risk and strategically delayed disclosures. The regulator observes consistent compliance and reduced deviation in reporting behavior. However, this consistency reflects synchronized adaptation rather than improved transparency, increasing dependence on procedural signals. The system now relies on the assumption that timely disclosure equates to timely risk visibility. But since timing has been optimized strategically, this assumption no longer holds, distorting system interpretation. Each reporting cycle reinforces the expectation that risk will surface only within protected intervals. Actors who deviate by disclosing earlier incur higher scrutiny without systemic benefit, tightening the lock-in. This creates a self-reinforcing equilibrium, where both regulator and market operate within the same temporal distortion. Behavior, reporting, and review all align around the reporting window, increasing rigidity. At this stage, the system cannot easily revert to continuous visibility without disrupting established incentives. The reporting window has shifted from a compliance mechanism to a structural boundary that organizes risk itself. In the earlier state, the system rewarded earlier visibility of risk because disclosure timing was loosely coupled to exposure. Under the reporting window structure, the reward shifts toward aligning disclosure with the protected interval. So timing compliance becomes more valuable than temporal accuracy. What the system now ignores is the period in which risk accumulates before disclosure. Behavior adapts by concentrating exposure into these unobserved intervals, since that portion of the timeline no longer carries proportional consequence. The penalty structure also changes in position rather than magnitude. Early disclosure outside the safe harbor attracts higher scrutiny, so acting sooner becomes a disadvantage relative to waiting. This redefines what counts as rational behavior inside the system. Actors no longer optimize for continuous transparency, but for procedural safety within fixed reporting boundaries. The equilibrium stabilizes when all participants align around the same timing constraint. Risk remains embedded in the system, revealed only at the point where the incentives make it least costly to do so.